So the Guardian piece is not containing references to the wholeness of the institutions discriminating against Muslims. And the Guardian is not talking about the reality that other institutions and organizations discriminated against discriminating against Muslims and other organizations that are supposedly not tenable, acceptable. And the Guardian is not talking about the obligations, legal obligations under the existing UK legislation. For example, the Human Rights Act. And I'll now go to the old edition. This is the old edition of the particular text authored by Tom Bingham. Now, Tom Bingham used to be a judge, and this particular item published by Alan Lane, Penguin Law, this particular paperback is Penguin Books, is stated as being published in 2010, so which is 13 years ago. And this is the book that I think this is the only one of this size that exists under the topic of rule of law. And this is a collection of Tom Bingham's lectures, I think. And I shall come to that. Well, this is the first introduction that, or the first paragraph of the introduction to this edition that Tom Bingham has written. This is in 2006. I was asked to give the sixth Sir David Williams lecture at the University of Cambridge. This is an annual lecture established in honor, not happily in memory, of a greatly respected legal scholar, leader, and college head in that university. The organizers generously offered me a free choice of subject. And then he goes into the difficulty of getting a free choice of subject. Such an offer always poses a problem to unimaginative people like myself. We become accustomed at school and university to being given a subject title for our weekly essay, and it was rather the same in legal practice. Clients came with a specific problem which they wanted answered, or appeared before the judge with a specific issue which they wanted, or in some cases, did not want resolved. There was never a free choice subject matter. That is based on his empirical evidence and experience. And he says, I chose as my subject the rule of law. I did so because the expression was constantly on people's lips. I was not quite sure what it meant, and I was not sure all those who used the expression knew what they meant, either or meant the same thing. In any event, I thought it would be valuable to be made to think about the subject. The more so, the expression had recently, for the first time, been used in an act of parliament. I'll read that again. For the first time, been used in an act of the British Parliament, described rather portentously as an existing constitutional principle. The legal correspondents of the leading newspapers largely ignored the lecture, save on one relatively minor point, understandably regarding it as old hat. And it certainly lacked the kind of outright criticism of the where government which whets the appetite of local leaders and responders. But Martin Kettle, writing in The Guardian on the 25th of November 2006, thought that the subject, I'll read that again. But Martin Kettle, writing in The Guardian on 25th of November 2006, thought the subject of some important and suggested we need leaders who better understand the rule of law. On the same day, the newspaper carried a headline asking, "Is this judge the most revolutionary?" Well, the judge meaning Bingham is referring to himself. Man in Britain, having a couple of years earlier described me as the radical who is leading a new English revolution. This would have surprised my former tutor, the distinguished historian Christopher Hill. But the headline question was left unanswered, and I should warn those who read this book for a revolutionary action plan that they are doomed to disappointment. Since then, interest in the subject has, I think, continued to grow, fortified by concerns about the interrelationship between the rule of law, human rights, and civil liberties on the one hand, and security against terrorist attack on the other. The subject is one which merits consideration at greater length than is possible in a lecture. But in this book, I have drawn heavily on what I said in that lecture and in others. All right, I'll go back to the issue of the Article 8, I think. I'll go to Article 8, which he discusses. Okay, this is the book Rule of Law that is written by Tom Bingham, and it's a penguin paperback, and it's Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life. Article 8 of the European Convention differs from all other articles in one respect and from the articles so far considered in another. Now, this book, of course, in terms of the context, has been taken by the regressive steps taken by the conservatives since this publication of this book, because the conservatives were not in power when Tom Bingham wrote this book. They were in opposition, and Tom Bingham wrote this while Tony Blair was in power. Now, it differs from this Article 8, that is, differs from all other articles in guaranteeing not a right to a particular outcome, that is, life, freedom, a fair trial, and so on, but a right to respect. Article 8, 1 says that everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. This recognizes that there are important areas of our private and personal lives which we are entitled to keep to ourselves and into which, generally speaking, the state has no business to intrude. The right to respect in Article 8.1, however, is qualified by what may be called a community exception, a recognition that the rights of the individual may properly be restricted in interests of the community at large if certain fairly demanding conditions are satisfied. This community exception, somewhat differently expressed, but to very much the same effect, also applies to Article 9, 10, and 11. In Article 8.2, The community exception, as I call it, provides, and I think that's a quotation, is there shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of this right except such as in accordance with the law and as and is necessary in a democratic society in the interests of national security, public safety, or economy. I'll read the whole paragraph again. There shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of this right, except such as in accordance with the law and is necessary in a democratic society in the interests of national security, public safety, or the economic well being of the country, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, or for the protection of the rights and freedoms of others. Ends the quotation. Thus, it is accepted that rights of the individual may have to be curtailed for the benefit of the wider community if there are conditions. But only if three conditions are met. The interference must be in accordance with the law. Other articles say prescribed by law, which better conveys the sense. The interference must be directed to one of the specific purposes, and it must be not merely desirable, useful, or reasonable, but necessary in a democratic society and proportionate. The protection given by the common law in this area has been patchy. It criminalized and gave civil remedies for assaults widely defined and any violation of a person's bodily integrity. Historically, it was robust in asserting the inviolability of the person's home. The Sir Edward Coke, perhaps the most influential English jurist of all time, famously declared that a man's house is his castle, and the Earl of Chatham scarcely less famously said, the poorest man may, in his cottage, bid defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may be shake. I'll read that again. Earl Chatham said, the poorest man may in his cottage bid fair defiance to all the forces of the crown. It may be frail, its roof may shake, the wind may blow through it, the storm may enter, the rain may enter, but the King of England cannot enter. All his forces dare not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement. But this was also a long time ago. A recent pamphlet, Crossing the Threshold, discusses 266 ways the state can enter your home, and this now appears in chapter 11 to be a considerably underestimate, to be a considerable underestimate. All these grounds of entry have received the blessing of Parliament and may be justified for one or another of the purposes recognized by the Convention. But it is plain that an Englishman's house is now a great deal more porous than Coke and Chatham ever conceived. There is no British law giving the protection afforded by the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, quoted in Chapter 2 above, which provides that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. The common law, that is the English common law, was powerless to prevent the unregulated interception by the state of private telephone conversations until an adverse decision of the European Court compelled the government to legislate. The common law also developed no coherent rules to protect privacy, while protecting duties of confidence and, for instance, the privacy of a prisoner's correspondence with his legal advisors. The common law was not very sensitive to the claims of personal anonymity. I'll read that one again because I've read that word wrongly. The common law was not very sensitive to the claims of personal autonomy, and as the case decided under the convention demonstrate, this is a difficult area. While the core of the right to which Article 8 is directed is clear enough, the outer reaches of the protection are more nebulous. The European Court has understood private life as extending to those features which are integral to a person's identity or ability to function socially as a person. But the drawing of lines to distinguish an intrusion, which is a violation of Article 8, from one which, however unwelcome, is no violation, involves a difficult exercise of judgment. Difficult this area may be, unimportant it is not. As the material gathered above about the public by government agencies multiplies exponentially, see chapter 11 below, the need to decide when the legitimate interest of government becomes the intrusive service of Big Brother seems likely to become ever more pressing. And there is this Article 9, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, what I am doing here is bringing into context the actual reality surrounding the behavior of Nigel Nasty Farage and the pressure put apparently on his behalf on the Coutts Bank and the NatWest Bank, the controlling bank. And it seems that none of those people who have been putting pressure on behalf of Nigel Nasty Farage, including Farage himself, who has got the so called subject access request outcome, none of these elements or sources have been actually explaining to what extent, if to any extent at all, the articles that Tom Bingham discusses under the human rights on chapter on page 66 have been actually affected or violated. The law must afford adequate protection of fundamental human rights, and this is not a principle which would be universally accepted as embraced within the rule of law. Dicey, which is a classic English kind of source, it has been argued, gave no such substantive consent. I'll read that again. This is not a principle which would be universally accepted as embraced within the rule of law. Dicey, it has been argued, gave no such substantive content to his rule of law concept. Professor Raz has written a non democratic legal system based on the denial of human rights, on extensive poverty, on racial segregation, sexual inequalities, and religious persecution may, in principle, conform to the requirement of the rule of law better than any of the legal systems of the more enlightened Western democracies. It will be an immeasurably worse legal system, but it will excel in one respect, in its conformity to the rule of law. The law may institute slavery without violation of law. Now, that is a very significant kind of query. It actually goes back to the query that I have had about rule of law. In fact, it goes back to the claims by the Nazis in Germany based on the apparent democracy that the Nazis enjoyed as fronted by, that is, the Nazis fronted by Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been democratically endorsed, and anything that the Nazis enacted as law then falls within the category of the rule of law, which is what this quoted Professor Raz is pointing out. And I'll read that again so that it becomes very clear as to what I'm pointing out. A non democratic legal system based on the denial of human rights, on extensive poverty, on racial segregation, sexual inequalities, and religious persecution may, in principle, conform to the requirements of the rule of law better than any of the legal systems of the more enlightened Western democracies. It will be an immeasurably worse legal system, but it will excel in one respect, in its conformity to the rule of law. The law may institute slavery without violation. I'll read that again. The law may institute slavery without violating the rule of law. So back to Tom Bingham, and he's talking about this. This is close to what some economists have called the thin definition of the rule of law. On the other hand, as Jeffrey Marshall has pointed out, chapter 7, 5, and 12 of Dicey's great work, in which he discusses what would now be called civil liberties, appear within part 3, 2 of the book entitled The Rule of Law. As Marshall observes, the reader could be forgiven for thinking that Dicey intended them to form part of what the rule of law meant for Englishmen. Both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the later international instruments linking procedure, uh, both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the later international instruments linking protection of human rights with the rule of law and the European Court of Human Rights has referred to the notion of the rule of law from which the whole convention draws its inspiration. The European Commission has consistently treated democratization, the rule of law, respect for human rights, and good governance as inseparably interlinked. While therefore one can recognize the logical force of Professor Raj's contention, I would roundly reject it in favor of a thick definition, embracing the protection of human rights within its scope. A state which savagely represses or persecutes sections of the people cannot, in my view, be regarded as observing the rule of law, even if the transport of the persecuted minority to the concentration camp, that is what Nazis is, yes? Concentration camps or the compulsory exposure of female children on the mountainside is the subject of detailed laws duly enacted and scrupulously observed. So to hold would, I think, that is, I mean, this is Tom Bingham's style of English. To hold so would, I think, be to strip the existing constitutional principles of the rule of law, affirmed by sections 1, affirmed by section 1 of the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, which is the act that was enacted during Tony Blair's last period as Prime Minister and widely recognized in the laws of other countries around the world of much of its virtue. This was accepted by the President of the Constitutional Court of Russian Federation at a symposium held by the International Bar Association in Moscow on the 6th of July 2007, when, as part of a lecture on the morality of the law, now read that, when, as part of a lecture on the morality of law, not the law, the President of the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation, V.D. Zorkin, said steps such as adoption of liberal laws, acknowledgement of common principles and norms of international law, and creation of corresponding state and public institutions are insufficient for the real rule of law. It is also important that statutes express the essence of law as mankind understands. It is also important that statutes express the essence of law as mankind understands it at each particular stage of its development. The great philosopher Spinoza once said that law was the mathematics of freedom. Law cannot be simply what it dictated. Law cannot be simply what is dictated by political authority or issued by the state. In the 20th century, there have been two examples of legal tragedies which were developing in parallel. One was totalitarian Soviet communism, and the other German Nazism. In the USSR, owing to efforts of the Stalinist regime, theoretician Wisniewski, the law was identified with statutory law, and law was identified with the will, or rather, dictatorship of the proletariat. Through such logic, whatever was prescribed by the state in the form of statutory law was lawful. Hitler followed yet a different ideological pathway, absolutely antagonizing. Read that again. Hitler followed yet a different ideological pathway, absolutely antagonistic to communist ideology, but the result was the same. In Nazi Germany, the law was an expression of the will of the German people. In Nazi Germany, the law was an expression of the will of the German nation, not people. And the will of the German nation was incorporated in the Führer. The law existed only as a body of statutory laws. Both systems are killing millions of people because for both the law was given and continued in the statutes. It is, of course, for states to decide what rights they will protect by law, and what sanctions they will impose for breach. But this is difficult area since there is no universal consensus on the rights and freedoms which are fundamental even among civilized nations. In some developing countries, a higher premium is put on economic growth than on protection of individual rights, and in some Islamic countries, little or no protection is given to some rights which are cherished elsewhere. It must be accepted that the other edges of some fundamental human rights are not clear cut, but within a given society there is ordinarily a large measure of agreement on where the lines are to be drawn at any point, even though standards change over time. And in the last resort, the courts are there to draw them. It is, I think, possible to identify the rights and freedoms which in the UK and developed Western or Westernized countries elsewhere are seen as fundamental, and the rule of law requires that those rights should be protected. Now, Tom Bingham is, of course, not a philosopher. Tom Bingham is not a thinker, independent thinker as he admits. He is a bureaucrat. And as one part of the book, he acknowledges his recognition of the philosophical importance of what Tony Blair said. So Tom Bingham should not be confused as an independent universal exponent of the universal values of rule of law in the context of observing human rights internationally. And citation and references to the Nazis, to the USSR, without the references to the, let's say, founding principles of the United Nations, for example, make a mockery of the pretense that by calling his speech, which is now extended in a particular book, Tom Bingham is recognizing universal principles and values, and that he's upholding superior principles and values and standards than the ones that he refers to as the Islamic countries. I would say that Islamic countries, non Islamic countries, and all the other forms and descriptions of societies must be deemed to be obliged to honor, respect, and recognize universal values that life, protect freedom of speech, and basic human needs are protected. Now, in the case of the nasty Nigel Farage so called affair, and in the resignation of Alison Rose, and in the resignation of the chief executive of the Coutts Bank, there is no evidence that Nigel Nasty Farage has been treated in violation of his right in comparison with other account holders. Secondly, there is no evidence that there is any consistent policy being followed by ordinary banks. Coutts is, let's say, treated as a private bank, Rotary Club and the so on. But the other banks, like the ordinary banking faces of NatWest Bank, Barclays Bank, etc., etc., the way they lawyers bank, the way they treat their customers or potential customers should be seen to be consistent with those universal values that actually do not discriminate on the basis of someone's opinions about things or someone's behavior outside of the remits of the banking or the financial activities that they engage in as part of their having the bank account with a particular bank. So there is nothing in terms of the United Kingdom Parliament that can be referred to as being certain kind of standards that banks should follow. There is nothing that has been found as being part of the judiciary and the guidance. It is mainly and mostly left to the individual banks. And that is something that all these supporters, so called, or fans of Nasty Nigel Farage have ignored, which is where the reported complaint, the very partial reported complaint from the Finsbury Morgue's chair in The Guardian come into relevance. In the Guardian piece, there is no reference to the law, there is no reference to any precedent, that is to say, any decision of the Supreme Court or the High Court or an appeal court, and there is no that has been expressly identified as either part of a bill going through Parliament or a proposed bill that may be going through Parliament. And as to the Gina Miller complaint, which has come to the fore today, there is no reference to her complaint. And to Nigel Farage, who says that 9 other banks refused him an account. There is no discussion about that. So, to force Alison Rose to resign from her post and to overly focus BBC, carrying a very small item attributed to Alison Rose, looks like an agenda, a nasty agenda to and to have a go elements for no reason. So there is this piece about 11 hours ago. There is a piece on this Times Radio YouTube, which is saying that the Farage's bank account row started with the Brexit Party. We shall be discussing all of those more later in later editions. Now back to the papers on Friday. This is the Communist Party Morning Star, and its front page of Friday, the 28th of July, is one word: obscene. And it talks about British gas posts record £969 million profits as extortionate bills plunge families into poverty. And there is a quote from Paul Nowak. Paul Nowak is probably a trade union person. While families across Britain have struggled to pay their bills, energy companies have been allowed to laugh all the way to the bank. This is a quote from Paul Nowak. Let's see what is in there on the other items. In a British newspaper, there is a pro Moscow item. Isn't it amazing? And the editor in the Morning Star is headed, "No one should be celebrating the bank's targeting of Farage." Could Nigel Farage be onto something? The erstwhile Brexit Party leader has told a home truth about British banks. They exist, he wrote, to make vast profits. They want people to think they are nicey, but they know this isn't how corporate life in a capitalist society really works. Correct. The row about the attempt by NatWest, in which the state has a big stake, inherited from the emergency public ownership of the Royal Bank of Scotland at the time of the 2008 crash, to close Farage's account because it found his views objectionable, is an exercise in obfuscation. Of course, banks should not be closing customer accounts because of their political views. The left, the left would be the main victim were it otherwise. And indeed, campaign managers have often been the victim of bank politics in this respect. Nor should they be discussing customers' financial details with journalists. NatWest has breached both these simple expressions in relation to the Farage affair, and as a result, its chief executive Alison Rose has been forced into resignation. Other heads may roll, since government ministers are backing Farage in his campaign for their own demagogic purpose. Most, including this newspaper, the Morning Star, will find some or all of the Farage's opinions objectionable. That is not a good enough reason for endorsing the bank's conduct. London's financial institutions have long been central to profitably laundering the cash of far more disreputable figures in any case. And there is a longer piece there, but I'm not reading the rest of it. It's a kind of convoluted, prevaricatory piece typical of the Morning Star. Now, there is a central page, pages 8 and 9, central article is that French crisis has reached an extreme level of gravity. Vincent Boulet speaks to Navid Shomali about the enormous riots that erupted following the police killing of a teenager in Nanterre and what the French Communist Party advocates in response. Now, this is a clearly corrupt warning scar. The teenager is not a teenager, you fucking anti Muslim cunts. The teenager was shot because of a Muslim. And his name, they miswrite his name, they misspell his name. He is written as Mahel. He's not Mahel, you fucking cunts. He's Nahel. So the Morning Scar, racist as ever, anti Muslim as ever, is not providing a real, ethical, accountable alternative to the existing racist mainstream media in the United Kingdom. So we shall come to continue to diagnose the institutional racism and the continuation of the lack of accountability, lack of audit, lack of transparency, and lack of universal human rights and rule of law for ordinary people in the United Kingdom. And we shall catch up with whatever Gina Miller can produce as a backup to her claim about Gina Miller being debanked. And it says anti Brexit campaigner Gina Miller was told a bank account for her political party would close without explanation. This is an item in the BBC website, and she in the Guardian the piece is heading Gina Miller voices fear for democracy over closure of her party's bank account. Now, what this is about is not just bank account. This is an issue is at the heart of the basic human rights of an individual in society. And I'll come to that in a second after reading this PA media copy being circulated in the Guardian website, timed at 13:04 BST, which would be 12:04 GMT, today, Friday, the 28th of July 2023. So, this is the heading Gina Miller voices fear for democracy over closure of her party's bank account. Access to banking for new parties needed in functioning democracy, says campaigner after Monzo decision. Let's see what the Monzo is talking about. The anti Brexit campaigner Gina Miller has said, "We don't have a functioning democracy. If new political parties cannot access banking services after she was told her own party's account would be closed, the government and financial services watchdog must step in," she said, to ensure new parties and members of parliament can access banking to be able to operate. Miller said it was a bigger issue than the closure of Nigel Farage's bank account, which led to a row resulting in the resignation of the top bosses at NatWest and Coutts. Miller, who came to prominence bringing legal cases over Brexit, was told earlier this month by Monzo that her True and Fair Party's account would close in September. She was told in a message on the bank's app, given no explanation. Monza has since said it does not accept any political parties and that the account was opened erroneously as it was not categorized as such in the application. The party, True and Fair Party, that is. 9 banks had turned down the True and Fair Party before it got the account with Monzo in November 2021, according to Miller. She told the Press Association news agency that is the bigger issue. The fact that as a new insurgent political party, you have no access to banking services, which is extraordinary in a democracy. The party has now found a small institution to bank with, but Miller says, what if they turn around in future and say, well, actually, we've decided for no reason that because you are a political party, you can't have a bank account. I think the government and the FCA, that is the Financial Conduct Authority, have got to step in straight away because if this happened, we lose our account in September for Monzo. And then another bank or our new provider decides that they will use the same rule saying, oh, well, we don't accept political parties. Then we, in effect, won't exist. We wouldn't be able to operate because we would not have any access to any banking services. Concerns over debanking have mounted after Farage said his account with Coutts was shut down because it disagreed with his political views. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak weighed in to say that his government was taking tough action to protect the free speech of banking customers. NatWest chief executive Dame Alison Rose stepped down this week after both Downing Street and the Treasury expressed their serious concern about her conduct after she admitted to being the source of an incorrect BBC report on the former UKIP leader's finances. Miller noted that Farage had been offered an alternative account with NatWest and said her case pointed to wider issues. What I'm saying is actually even bigger than that, which is how can we have a proper functioning democracy if we can't have new parties or new elected people? She also raised concerns about newly elected MPs being debanked due to lenders using rules around politically expressed persons. Now, read that again. She also raised concerns about newly elected MPs being debanked due to lenders using rules around politically exposed persons, PEP, in a dysfunctional way. Her True and Fair Party is standing by 9 candidates in the next general election, with Miller running against the Tory former Minister Chris Grayling in Epsom and Ewell. The financial regulator is looking into whether PEP rules over anyone considered to be higher risk because of their political connections are applied too rigorously by banks amid concerns many British politicians are denied accounts. Monzo said, like lots of banks, we do not accept any political parties as Monzo business customers in the same way that we don't currently accept trusts, clubs, and a range of other organizations. In this case, the account wasn't originally categorized as a political party. After this was identified and corrected, the customer was given notice that the account would be closed. We recognize that this experience have been frustrating for the customer, and we are sorry for that. There is no suggestion Monzo factored Miller's political views into its decision. So this is a press association copy. So we shall be looking at the role of the Guardian in promoting the likes of local councils, as typified in the piece byline to Politonby and headed Opinion Civil Service. We laid Bob Carslake to rest this week. Think of him and give the civil service the respect it deserves. Now, as I have said in, well, hundreds of published and publications, the Guardian is corrupt, and the Guardian's corruption in the context of civil service is similar to the corruption of the Guardian in promoting the regime fronted by Luthuraman in Tower Hamlets during the period 2010, October 2010, until the Luthuraman was kicked out by the decision made by the election commissioner Richard Morey on the 23rd of April 2015. And I'll come to a very brief re-reference, recitations of these significant items of collusion with the corrupt regime fronted by Luthuraman by the Guardian. There was a man who was in the St. Paul's Cathedral who is absolutely dubious about his identity, his origin, etc., etc. Now, when the St. Paul's Cathedral was the subject of a series of demonstrations about 10 years ago or so, this individual decided to become part of the demonstrators or the cause the demonstrators were kind of proposing or advancing or advocating. So he became a Guardian columnist. And when the Lutheraman fronted regime in Tower Hamlets, with Lutheran being in the post of the incumbent elected mayor, dishonestly imitated dozens of Labour Party controlled councils across England and appointed an absolutely dishonest thing called the Fairness Commission. This individual was made chairman of the Fairness Commission by Tower Hamlets Council as fronted by Luther Roman. Let's check the details so that we don't get the details wrong. This is a embarrassingly stupid and dishonest description of Giles Fraser. He is overstated the Dr. Giles Fraser, chair of the Tower Hamlets Fairness Commission. This title of doctor I have not come across before, but let's see where this doctorate allegedly comes from. This is the one I'm referring to about as being the St. Paul's Cathedral bureaucrat. Now, the Wikipedia entry doesn't call him doctor. He's Giles Anthony Fraser, as shown, born on the 27th of November 1964, and is being described as an English Anglican priest, journalist, and broadcaster who has served as vicar of St. Anne's Church in Kew. So let's see the details. It's a contradiction. It says early life and education. This is not an Anglican by birth. It says Fraser was born to a Jewish father and a Christian mother and was circumcised according to Jewish tradition. He was educated at Hollingbury Court Preparatory School in Sussex, and so his Church of England, Canterbury, Southwark, and was appointed in February 2022. This is a new one. Other posts he held president of Inclusive Church and born in Aldershot in Hampshire, England. And his father was Anthony Fraser, and his mother was Gillian Fraser. And he has got two daughters and three sons. And his occupation, priest, journalist, and broadcaster. And this is the one that I was looking for. He was a canon, described as a canon. Well, here he is described as a canon chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral from 2009 to 2011. Now, what happened after that was that he became, as I said, he became a supporter of Occupy London, based its protest outside the cathedral, where Fraser said that he was happy for people to exercise their right to protest peacefully. However, he resigned as he could not sanction any policy of the chapter that involved using force to remove the protesters. He has said that it was a huge matter of regret to leave St. Paul's, but not for one moment have I thought that I did the wrong thing. Let's check if he's got any reference there to tar humblers. There is, there appears to be no reference to his role in tar humblers. Let's go back to what I was saying. He did this thing, chair of the Fairness Commission, which was a complete, utter, absolute pack of lies. So, despite the fact that he has got this whole and career as a church based or religion based or faith based careerist, Giles Fraser has been lying in promoting Tar Hamlets Council as the chair of this Fairness Commission because it was a pack of lies, and we shall be doing an update on the pack of lies, Tar Hamlets pack of lies, in another kind of broadcast or edition because there is not going to be enough time to go into every aspect of the corruption involved in Tar Hamlets. According to Giles Fraser, who was a columnist on The Guardian, the then editor of The Guardian, Alan Rabisha, had his wife Fairness Commission commissioners. I'll come to the names of these people, Lindsay McKee and the others, and I'll show how corrupt the Guardian is and has been in promoting especially corrupt councils. And for that reason, the tribute that The Guardian is published by Politonby for the just deceased Bob Carslake is completely dishonest. In addition to the fact that Carslake is being praised by Politonby as a civil servant, not as a member of the ordinary population, tells the story that Politonby is a complete and absolute disgrace. She is foisting the image of civil servants by hiding and denying the role being played by ordinary people campaigning for ethics, morality, and justice. And then I'll talk about the FT lunch, FT lunch with this so-called professor Snyder. So the Fairness Commission version that is online, accessible online in the Tower Hamlets Council website, doesn't have the name of the commissioners, probably for the reasons to do with the campaign. Well, I have been campaigning and condemning the role of the Guardian's editor, Alan Rabishar, and his partner, Lindsay McKee, being a commissioner appointed by the corrupt Lutheraman when this bogus commission was appointed. Now, I have known Ob, well, I have met her several times, but I have had no experience whatsoever of doing any journalism along with her. But I have known of Lindsay McKee since I met her more than 40 years ago. So I know her as a journalist. I didn't know her as being either in a partnership with Alan Ravisha or being married to him until much later. But the fact that I knew about it later than she had been in a relationship with him is immaterial because she is connected with Alan Rabisha. And Alan Rabisha was the chief editor of the Guardian Group. So she was there appointed to be a commissioner in the Tar Hamlets Fairness Commission along with Giles Fraser. Now, Giles Fraser was also a published column writer or comment writer on The Guardian. So there are two of them. In addition, that there was this London edit, London diarist or London blogger that is no longer there but used to be the Guardian's London blogger who was publishing very supportive pieces for the corrupt regime officially fronted by Luthuraman. Throughout the 5 years or 6 calendar years that Luthuraman was in that corrupt post. So Dave Hill, Lindsay McKee, Giles Fraser, I mean, three of them connected with the Guardian were supporting Luthuraman's corrupt regime. In addition to that, when the when the then chief executive in Tower Hamlets Council was playing the role of promoting the idea of having Tower Hamlets having an elected mayor. Dave Hill didn't criticize the advocacy of the corrupt purpose. I wrote several comment pieces published at the time online, but because of the changes in their corrupt policies by these outlets, including the London Evening No Standard, they have removed those, not just my comments, but all the other comments from the websites. They were extensive and detailed, and the name of this individual was, let's check this one name because it's a Channel 4 program. Now, this one was 13 years ago, exactly this. It was on 22nd of July 2010, and it's a promotion piece carried on the Evening Standard, No Standard website. The piece is headed Town Hall Boss Goes Undercover to Find Out How to Cut 50 million pounds. A council chief went undercover as a trainee to help find ways to make more than 50 million pound of cuts. Now you can see the brazen hypocrisy in the whole thing. Tower Hamlets chief executive Kevin Collins is a crook himself. And this crook was imposed as chief executive. And this crook was the crook that was doing the crooked promotion for the corrupt Luthuraman. So if you add these crooks' corruption, along with the corruption, complicity perpetrated by the Guardian lot, you can see just how thick the crookedness of the Guardian, Kevin Collins, and the Evening Standard's partly truthful account and partly lying account constituted. And the Evening Standard piece says that he was taking part in a Channel 4 documentary, Undercover Boss, which is being screened on at 9 p.m. tonight, which was the 22nd of July 2010. Tar Hamlets covers some of the most deprived parts of the East End of London. Well, I'm paraphrasing some because of the clarity in the paraphrasing as compared to the lack of clarity contained in the actual print. Tar Hamlets covers some of the most deprived parts of the East End of London in the United Kingdom, but must make savings in excess of £50 million over 3 years as a result of feared cut of up to a quarter of its government grant. After a week of after a week incognito, that is undercover, Mr. Collins revealed his identity to shocked staff and praised their dedication to their jobs. What he meant was praise their dedication to the cuts. He said what we were doing was huge, high quality. Not in any way was it the case that because people were poor, the services they got were poor. Fuck off, the lying shit. Mr. Collins said it would be a crying shame if residents in deprived areas ended up bearing the consequences of government cutbacks. That is the absolute lie, this liar. And this continues the quoted lies of the liar. As I said, we shall be updating on the role played by the Channel 4 criminals in promoting the crooks of Tar Hamlets Council. Because in addition to this crook Kevan Collins, Channel 4 criminals broadcast a series of lies called How to Get a Council House. And those lies were based on Tower Hamlets. And exactly the same way they lied about Tower Hamlets featuring Kevan Collins, they lied by featuring other lying criminal employees in the Tower Hamlets Council. The thing that I have pointed out over the years since condemning this series is that the most significant thing about that series was that not one single councillor, not one elected councillor, elected in the name of Tar Hamlets community, in the name of Tar Hamlets people, with the votes of the Tower Hamlets voters, appeared on any of these programs. It is not just shocking, it's a criminal. So we shall be talking about all of this in due course in other editions because the details are so extensive that they need more time and longer duration of a program. We shall come to an end to this, which is 21:52 hours GMT, and the duration of this particular one is, of course, 1 hour and 20 minutes.